Do you guys like this park?
You like this park? Yeah.
This is a nice park.
It's really great.
I met Miss Barbara Kelly, a resident of Decatur, Alabama, on a warm, windy day in April. We started in Delano Park, a grassy area originally called City Park and founded in 1887 that today spans 28 acres. A festival had just wrapped up, so the park was lively. She's just like having all the fun popping those balloons.
There are hundreds of balloons.
But it's nice ambiance, like in the midst of a neighborhood here.
Yes, it's always been in the midst of a neighborhood. This was the heart of Decatur when it was built.
Barbara and I walked to a more quiet spot so she could tell me more about herself and how this park became such an important part of her life.
I got involved with the park because I live practically across the street. And when there was going to be a renovation of the Rose Garden, I wanted to be involved.
When Barbara got involved in the year 2000, the Rose Garden was a rose garden in name only.
1934, 2,000 roses when it opened. And by the time we were here, there were no flowers. There was just basically just a concrete circle in the middle of the garden. And it was bleak. It just been loved so much, but just never had been repaired and restored.
Barbara became part of a small crew who called themselves the Friends of Delano Park. Today, they go by the Delano Park Conservancy. Their goal was to make a plan for the park's preservation.
I never realized that it would become like so much because we just started with the Rose Garden. We knew nothing about the history.
But as Barbara started digging into the history, she discovered something fascinating. The Rose Garden and the park's other structures had all been designed by a local woman in 1933, at a time when a woman architect was rare indeed. This woman's name was Carolyn Cortner Smith. Barbara was intrigued and wanted to know more. So she started looking up Carolyn Cortner Smith in the archives. She started talking to people that knew her when she was alive. From her interviews and research, Barbara was able to start piecing Carolyn's story together.
When she was 18, she decided she wanted to be an architect, and she tried to get into Auburn. They didn't take women. She tried to get in the University of Pennsylvania. They didn't take women. She tried to get into Yale. They didn't take women. So she asked for all the course outlines, and she got Yale's Time Saver Manual for architecture. And she taught herself. So by 1919, she was licensed in the state of Alabama as an official architect.
She's believed to be the first licensed female architect in this state.
She did not have a degree, but she built over 700 structures in Alabama and the Southeast.
And that included many in Decatur. In fact, she had designed many buildings that Barbara had seen her whole life growing up in the city. She just didn't know their architect until now.
Decatur has a long history of unique, bold, and dare we say difficult women. Carolyn Cortner Smith was just as ahead of her time as her predecessors. But more than any of them, she left her physical mark on the city of Decatur. And we're lucky, because a few years before she died, Carolyn recorded some oral histories of her life for posterity.
And today, we're sharing her story with you.
Welcome to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media that preserves place through story. My name's Vanessa Quirk, a cities journalist.
And I'm Dale Hussein Wetzel, a historic preservationist. And this is part 2 of our series on the history of Decatur, Alabama.
This episode is all about Mrs. Carolyn Cortner Smith. You'll hear about Carolyn's life, from her precocious childhood to her unlikely career in architecture to her successful construction business.
You'll get to know the buildings she designed, some of which are still standing today.
And you'll get to hear the mark she's left on her beloved city of Decatur, and the ways others in the city are working hard to make sure her presence is never erased.
Carolyn was born in 1894 and grew up on a plantation east of Cortland, a city about 21 miles west of Decatur. Carolyn idolized her father, so much so that as an adult, she wrote a book about him called Keys to Success.
And my father was really a go-getter. He did not mind work, and he knew how to do things instinctively, as smart as he could be.
Carolyn's father co-owned multiple gins and sold cotton internationally. She was born into a powerful, well-connected white family. And she was close with her little sister Josephine, who was the goody two-shoes. Carolyn was the troublemaker.
As a young child, Carolyn would pick up the cattle horns lying around the pasture and build structures out of them. There was also a lot of wood around. She'd build with that too. One time in particular stood out in Carolyn's memory.
She was 5 and her sister Josephine 3. Carolyn was busy assembling a lean-to when her father came over to inspect her handiwork.
And he said, "What are you babies doing?" And my little sister spoke up and said, "Bee's building a house."
Carolyn's sister called her Bee.
Bee says when she's grown, she's going to build houses. Isn't that silly for a girl? And Daddy says, "I don't know, baby. Why?" I said, "What are you going to do?" She says, "I'm going to live in the houses Bee is."
Of course, Carolyn did go on to build houses, and Josephine would live in them too. But that's getting ahead of ourselves.
The family moved to Decatur in 1907. Carolyn requested to skip the 7th grade and go straight to the 8th. So her academic life kept her busy, and her social life did too. The newspapers of the time show Miss Cortner attending many a party in Decatur.
After graduating at the age of 15, Carolyn attended Ward Belmont College, a woman's only junior college in Nashville, Tennessee. And she decided she was going to study architecture.
And I was told that that was nothing that a girl could do. That was for men. And if I studied architecture, I would do nothing about it. And it would just be something that was wasted. I knew whether they let me build houses then and there or wherever, I was going to build houses. I had made up my mind.
On her 18th birthday, Carolyn's father bought her a Cadillac, a brand that she would love for the rest of her life. And the man who delivered the vehicle was Wilburn Smith, a Cadillac salesman from Birmingham, Alabama. Everyone called him Red.
They met in May and were married in December. Remember, in those days, 1912, husbands usually decided what their wives could or couldn't do. But Carolyn chose her mate well.
I said to my husband, "I want to study architecture." He says, "What's stopping you?"
When Yale, Auburn, and the University of Pennsylvania rejected her, ostensibly because she was a woman, Carolyn wasn't daunted.
So I got the Auburn course, the University of Pennsylvania course, the Yale course, and I spent 8 years in a Cadillac automobile riding with him when he was calling on his customers he had in his territory.
Carolyn would often stay in Decatur while Red was traveling for work. On the weekends, they'd spend time together in Birmingham at Red's family's place.
Carolyn wanted a home for them, and she didn't want to buy one. She wanted to build one. One day, when she was out driving in the country south of Birmingham, near the Cahaba River, her Cadillac got flat. As her chauffeur changed the tire, she wandered around, and in very Carolyn fashion, decided immediately that this was going to be the spot.
She bought the land and started the work in 1912, when she was still 18 years old. The building still stands today, so we called up the gentleman who calls it home.
My soul is in Kent, England, and this is as close to Kent as I've ever come.
That's Norman Kent Johnson, a landscape architect, the former garden design editor of Southern Living magazine, and the proud owner of Carolyn Cortner Smith's first home. We asked Norman how he came to own this property.
The story starts in early spring of 1987. Norman had just gotten back from a month-long trip to England.
It was a bitter cold February day, and it was the same kind of weather, slightly overcast, a little misty, very romantic weather. Walked up the little stone-lined lane, very narrow, 15 feet wide, and my house was this little story and a half, 2-story stone cottage. Think of Snow White. And I almost burst into tears. I said, "I'm home."
He wrote a check almost immediately and owned the home just a few weeks later.
His small cottage was very close to a bigger, grander house down the lane.
He discovered his neighbor in the big house was an elderly lady named Carolyn Cortner Smith, the woman who had not only designed and built his cottage, but all the houses on Cahaba Road.
Friends of friends knew her. And so I had them call Mrs. Smith and say, "Your new neighbor, Norman Johnson, would like to meet you." And she says, "Well, come on over on Sunday afternoon." And so I did, and we had tea. I mean, real tea on a Sunday afternoon.
Perhaps not too surprisingly for someone who designed a stone cottage, Mrs. Smith was an Anglophile too.
We did talk about England a great deal. She wasn't exactly friendly initially. I mean, I got interrogated. She had beautiful manners. Don't get me wrong on that. I would say grand and self-possessed and patently intelligent. No doubt she was smart.
Carolyn told him the story of how she came to design his cottage at the tender age of 18.
This lot was up on the side of a hill. I learned more from that than anything else because I never had built before. I didn't know anything.
And critically, she hired a stonemason from Scotland.
And he knew more about stone than anything that I've ever heard of. So immediately the first thing I thought of was, we have all of this wonderful stone and we build houses out of it. And that's what we did.
Our native stone is sort of a rusty brown, but in time it oxidizes to a really beautiful golden brown. It's 18-inch thick stone walls on dirt.
The cottage was a little feat of construction.
I mean, it was a hand-built house. There was no access to any sort of power equipment. It was all masons with chisels and sledgehammers and hand saws. She told me that she used my house as her drawing board, as her experiment. She tried various architectural details inside the house that she either used in her house or in the other dozen houses she built in the neighborhood.
Carolyn used the cottage on Cahaba Road as her laboratory, figuring out how to build. From the beginning, she was inspired by English architecture and started developing her signature stone style.
After the cottage, she moved on to the big house on Cahaba Road for herself and Red, and then started designing and building houses for family members, including a grand stone Tudor-looking house on 623 Grant Street, southeast Decatur, which she built for her mother sometime between 1913 and 1920.
Carolyn brought in Irish and Italian carpenters and stonemasons to do the craftswork. And as she did in Cahaba, she built smaller houses on the property where the workers could live while they were building the big house.
Like the Cahaba house, the Grant house has a roof that looks like it's made from Italian tile, but it's actually thin sheets of concrete. We got a chance to check it out when we were there, and it was really gorgeous.
And people in Decatur must have thought it was great too, back when it was new. In 1919, Carolyn gained 3 new clients.
Carolyn designed and built another big stone Tudor house, and then 2 others made from brick. But no matter the material, they're all recognizably Carolyn.
Soon after these houses, Carolyn was given an opportunity to take her business to the next level.
When you start out being expecting opportunities to come and have the cash to pick up the things whenever they come to you, opportunities come to you from every direction.
In 1924, the opportunity came from a millwork factory, a place Carolyn often went to purchase materials. It was run by 2 gentlemen who were struggling to make ends meet. And one day, one of them turned to her and said,
I wish you would buy this mill and give us a job. I said, heck, I don't know anything about running a mill. But you know, sometimes it takes a lot of nerve in business to get what you want. And the nice part about it is when we are young, sometimes I didn't have sense enough to know that I didn't know anything. And that can help you more than anything in the world, not to realize your deficiencies or your capabilities or anything else, because then you try your wings.
The next morning, Carolyn bought the mill. She called it the Carolyn Lumber Company.
She would go on to buy more lumber companies throughout Decatur and Cortland and started managing a workforce of craftsmen. They manufactured fixtures, windows, and doors. They repaired antiques.
All of a sudden, before you know it, you have just built yourself up a business.
There were few women architects of the time, but being an architect and an entrepreneur, I spoke with one architectural historian who told me that was practically unheard of.
While Carolyn was busy running her small architecture and construction empire, she found out that Auburn University had started running an architectural exam to license architects. She volunteered immediately.
And hey, They asked me a few questions. They started asking me about the weights and spans and things like that, and about plumbing and heating. But it's things I've been doing for years, and if I didn't know it by that time, why I would be so dumb. I knew it.
Even though she didn't have an official degree, Carolyn got her architectural license. And while we can't confirm it for sure, she was likely the first woman in Alabama to do so.
And perhaps that piece of paper gave her a confidence boost because a few years later, she would make one of the boldest business moves of her life.
1929. The stock market has crashed, leading the country into a Great Depression. The L&N Railroad, which employed 2,000 people, has left the city of Decatur, leaving many out of work. The price of cotton has plummeted to 5 cents a pound. Times are tough.
Carolyn is keeping her ears wide open for job opportunities for her and her men. And one day, she gets a tip. The Mars family, of candy bar fame, is looking to build a barn out on their Milky Way farms in Pulaski, Tennessee.
A now 35-year-old Carolyn got in her Cadillac and drove 67 miles north of Decatur to see the property manager. But he told her there was just no way she could see the architect, a Mr. James F. Drake. He was far too busy, he said.
Carolyn got back in her car, feeling frustrated. But then she noticed a dashing figure on horseback.
He had on chamois work gloves that perfectly matched his Palomino horse's mane and tail. She just knew he was connected to the farm. So she motioned for him to come on over and asked if he would talk to Mr. Drake for her.
He says, I'll be glad to. And he rode off. And in a few minutes, Mr. Drake, he came across a field, and then he looked at me. He says, what do you know about mill work?
Carolyn said she'd like to make a bid for the commission. She paid close attention to what he said. He wanted 70 Dutch doors. She drove back to Decatur and drew up plans for the doors immediately.
Then she made a risky move. She hadn't gotten the job yet, but she went ahead and bought all the lumber she'd need anyway. Then she drove back to Milky Way Farms to see Mr. Drake.
So I handed him these plans. He says, where did you get those plans? I said, I did them just as soon as I got home. He said, you didn't tell me you could draw plans. I said, well, you didn't ask me. He says, how soon can you get them to me? I said, after tomorrow. Oh, well, the next day at the least. And I told him a price. And with a very nice profit in it. And he said, I have never seen a woman in this business before. I said, well, I've never been in it before either. This is my first time.
It mustn't have thrown off Mr. Drake too much because Carolyn won the commission.
She gleefully drove back to Decatur to tell her mill manager the news. They had 70 doors to build in about 2 days.
Well, he said, Miss Smith, I don't think it's possible. Well, I said, let's try starting in the morning and see if we can get it done or not.
Carolyn was right. They worked days and nights, and they got it done.
Carolyn went on to help Drake build houses, offices, and barns on the farm. She even helped with the landscaping, too.
And I pulled through the depression on that contract, don't you see?
And then another project came Carolyn's way. A project that would do more than any other to solidify her legacy in her beloved Decatur.
In 1933, a local powerhouse pulled some strings and got the then president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to Decatur so he could see the city firsthand, which was suffering greatly in the Depression.
Not long after, Roosevelt started something called the Civilian Workers Administration, a precursor to the WPA. The CWA didn't exist long, only about 4 months, but luckily, the city of Decatur was one of the few recipients of its funding.
The money was for 2 projects. The first, the restoration of the old State Bank, one of the oldest buildings in the city. Carolyn Cortner Smith got the job. Her company repaired the roof, doors, windows, and counters. She designed a little auditorium upstairs and commissioned a mural. And she built a brick wall in the backyard.
The second CWA project was to create some buildings for City Park, which was just about to be renamed in FDR's honor to Delano Park. Carolyn was asked if she would take on this job, too.
She got to work designing 5 structures: a large dance pavilion, a wading pool with a bathhouse, a smaller picnic pavilion, a bandstand, and, of course, the Rose Garden.
When I met Barbara at Delano Park in April, I asked if she would take me around to see some of them.
Thank you for taking the time, by the way.
Oh, this is my passion.
We started at the larger dance pavilion, which today is known as the Girl Scout Little House.
The Girl Scout Little House, little like rectangular stone structure. It's built of stone?
It's built of stone. Originally, it was open, totally open, like a band shell.
When Carolyn designed the dance pavilion, it had 4 large open arches on each side. If you were inside it, you could be covered but still exposed to the elements.
And all that cross ventilation makes a lot of sense for a dancing pavilion.
And then in 1946, the city gave the Girl Scouts permission to close it in, and they did.
Now the arches have been filled in with concrete blocks and windows. And to this day, the Girl Scouts use it for their meetings.
And apparently, it's one of the only Girl Scout little houses left in the country.
Then Barbara took me to the bathhouse, a rectangular stone building which today faces a stone and concrete splash pad where kids were enjoying playing in the water. Barbara told me that when Carolyn designed it, it was a wading pool. And Barbara loved the space as a kid. Then she took me to one of the park's most popular structures, the bandstand.
Yeah, this is nice.
It really
It's like
is.
a little gazebo kind of a thing. So it's like made of
Right.
stone, right? These columns are
Yeah,
stone.
these are all native stone. And the stone structures brought people back into the park. It brought recreation into the park.
What would you say your favorite Carolyn Cortner Smith structure is?
The Rose Garden is definitely my favorite structure, just the wall of the Rose Garden, because that's the heart of the park. It's what everybody thinks about when they think about the park.
I love the Rose Garden when I went too. When you enter in from the road, you pass through this stone entryway that makes you feel like you're entering a secret garden. There's a gravel path that leads you to a circular plot of roses lined carefully with manicured hedges and trees. Stone columns sit in a semicircle around the landscaping, and a bench sits between each set of columns, inviting a passerby to sit and literally smell the roses.
And I think it was kind of her centerpiece because it just symbolized rebirth after the Depression, after Decatur had nothing, and then suddenly they had a place of beauty.
Barbara thinks that of all her projects, Carolyn may have been particularly proud of the structures in Delano Park.
She never had children. Her passion was building. She would have been very into this because it's a civic space for everyone.
The park was one of Carolyn's crowning achievements and one of the last big projects of her career.
In 1943, Carolyn sold her lumber companies and devoted herself to practicing architecture and traveling.
After World War II ended, she started to travel alone. She did it so often that a travel agency asked her to conduct tours in Europe.
And ended up mixed up in everything that I had no business getting in and having a wonderful time.
In 1951, when Carolyn was 57, her husband passed away. These might have been dark years for her, but she certainly didn't paint them so in her oral history.
I lost my husband 26 years ago, and I've lived alone in this house since then. Everybody thinks I'm crazy, and I think it's just heaven to be here and do everything you want to and have a lot of friends in and everything.
Carolyn loved to invite artists and musicians to her house in Birmingham.
Life at 84 can be more magnificent than anything you can imagine. Now, old age to me is 100. Of course, I don't mean that I am going to stop at 100. If you ever stop, you fall flat on your face and never get up again. But if you keep going, I just have a feeling that I may push that 100 mark.
She kept working till the very end. In 1987, Carolyn slipped on some ice on Cahaba Road and broke her hip. Her health declined quickly after that. She died on August 1st, 1987, and was buried in Decatur City Cemetery with her family.
In 1998, a statue titled Civitas, representing the civil act of placemaking, was erected in her honor in Birmingham.
In Decatur, in the early 2000s, Carolyn's nephews, Henry and George McCrary, had a placard placed in Delano Park, commemorating their aunt's memory.
And Barbara Kelly and the Friends of Delano Park are doing their part to keep Carolyn's legacy alive by caring for the park structures and preserving them every day.
Luckily, Carolyn's stone buildings are sturdy. They can take a lot of hits. And also luckily, the City of Decatur has recognized the importance of the park and stepped up to protect it.
The Architectural Review Board protects the park a great deal. We've had that since 1993, but it was not enforced well, and now it's very much enforced.
And Barbara and her colleagues know that preservation isn't just about restoring and protecting materials. It's about activating people, making places meaningful and essential to a community.
It's something that was so clear to me when Barbara showed me the bandstand.
This was one of our major projects. It's for playground for people with disabilities, and it's made the bandstand very meaningful again because everyone wants to go there.
And the final key ingredient, according to Barbara, the thing that brings her hope for the future of the park, is the unique story of Mrs. Carolyn Cortner Smith herself.
That's why I'm hopeful it will be here for my grandchildren and for everyone.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media that preserves place through story. Your hosts are me, Vanessa Quirk, and Decca Hussein Wetzel. This episode was written by me, Vanessa, with editorial support from Andrew Calloway and research support from Kimberly Rose. It was produced by me and Decca and edited and mixed by Andrew Calloway. Theme music is by Adam James Levin Arity.
Many thanks to Caroline Swope and the City of Decatur who made this episode possible. This material was produced with assistance from the Historic Preservation Fund administered by the National Park Service, Department of the Interior. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of the Interior.
Huge thanks to Barbara Kelly, who not only lent her voice, but much of her research for this episode. Thanks also to Norman Kent Johnson, Melanie McCrary, Donna Morris, and Karen McNeil, who gave us very helpful context on women architects of this time period, and Phil Wiry and John Allison, who both gave us information on significant women in Decatur's history.
The oral histories you heard throughout this episode were courtesy of the Alabama Historical Commission. You can access these recordings via the Shelby County Museum and Archives website, www.shelbycountyhistory.com.
This episode was part 2 of our Decatur series and concludes season 3. If you want to keep up with us and what we're up to, please follow us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture or subscribe to our newsletter at urbanistmedia.org.
Urbanist Media is a 501c3. If you believe in the work we do preserving underrepresented places through story and would like to help us make more episodes in the future, then please consider making a tax-deductible donation via Venmo or PayPal at Urbanist Media.
Okay, I think that's it for this episode and this season. Deck, would you mind hitting the lovely people with our new tagline?
Urban Roots, preserving place through story.